Okay, well, welcome everyone to the second session of the conference. I'm Chris Millward. I work at the University of Birmingham here in the UK. This session is about what are the effects of higher education for graduates. So I'm sure that all of us in this room have had and are having a rich experience of universities, and we believe that's meaningful in itself. But of course, there's a great deal of interest from graduates and families, from government and employers in the effects of higher education beyond the experience of study. And indeed, universities themselves make a big deal about the effects of higher education beyond the time that students spend in higher education. And there's a rich vein of research in this area that we'll hear about now. So we're going to look at this through the lens of 4 CG projects that have been running during the period of the centre. They will be in turn Claire Callender's work from here in UCL, which is focused on student loan debt and decision making, although I think Claire's going to range a bit more widely around the topic of the effects of universities for graduates. We'll then look at the graduate labour market, particularly issues of equity in the graduate labour market, with Golo Henseke, who's also here at UCL. Then the experiences of Chinese graduates from UK universities beyond graduation, which Ho Mok from Lingnan University in Hong Kong is going to talk about. And then finally, Paul, who you've met already from Lancaster University, will talk about the project he's been running on graduate experiences and employability. The format is broadly that each person will talk for 10 to 12 minutes, and then we'll run a Q&A, and then there are some breakout discussions for an hour after this, and we'll explain how that will work after we've finished here. So without further ado, Claire, I'm going to hand over to you.
One of the lessons I've learnt from my research and policy work on student funding is that all countries face very similar problems and policy dilemmas. And these issues were particularly well articulated by Tro, that Simon has already referred to. And in 1973, Tro argued, and I quote, "In every advanced society, the problems of higher education are problems associated with growth. Growth poses a variety of problems for the education systems that experience it and for the societies that support them." And Tro explored the relationship between expansion, equity, and quality. And he poses the dilemma of how an expanding higher education system can maintain its quality and be affordable. He argues that uncontrolled higher education growth places intolerable burdens on national and state budgets. So he suggests that nations have 2 choices. Either the unit of resource must be reduced, potentially at the expense of quality and standards, or expansion is restricted at the expense of equity. Later, he suggests, and I quote, "No society could make the political and financial decision to radically restrain expansion in order to maintain an equality of cost and provision of higher standards across the board." So he supports the introduction of cost-sharing policies, namely tuition fees and loans, as a solution. Now, arguably, one of the limitations of Tro's work is the way in which he narrowly focuses on equity in terms of access to higher education. Another limitation is his concentration on the affordability of HE expansion for nation states and government budgets, potentially at the expense of affordability for students and graduates, which has been the focus of my research. So across the globe, we're all trying to solve the same problems, but we are trying to tackle the dilemma of how an expanding education system can maintain its quality and be affordable. but the political, economic, cultural, and ideological contexts of each country are actually paramount for understanding how each country responds to these shared problems and dilemmas, and the policies and policy instruments they adopt to solve them. And the combination of funding choices the Westminster governments have made since 1990 are quite distinctive. Indeed, England, in terms of its funding mechanisms, is an outlier. It's an outlier compared to other countries in the world, especially the OECD, because it has very high average tuition fees. It's an outlier because student loans are the only guaranteed source of government-funded student support, covering all tuition fees and some maintenance. There is no national system of grants and scholarships, unlike the rest of the UK and actually most other countries. And loan take-up is extremely high, something like 96%, making students in England more reliant on publicly funded financial support than students elsewhere. And consequently, students in England leave with the highest levels of student loan debt within the OECD. And this, combined with the loan repayment system, means it takes English graduates far longer, on average, to repay their debts than graduates elsewhere. And finally, I would argue that England is an outlier because of the government's reliance on student loans to fund undergraduate teaching and the resulting lack of public funding, despite it being a predominantly public system of higher education. So what the most recent research suggests is that the Westminster government only contributes, on average, 16% of the costs of undergraduate teaching. The other 84% of the costs comes from students and graduates. So what does this all mean for graduates? Well, today's financial responsibility for undergraduate higher education lies with individual student borrowers and graduate debtors. And this shift away from the state's responsibility is absolutely the hallmark of England's higher student funding reforms since 1990. All of those reforms have encouraged indebtedness, especially amongst the poorest, who now graduate with the highest levels of student loan debt. These government funding policies have individualized higher education funding and normalized student loan debt as an investment in future earnings potential. This signals a much more individualized concept of public interest, a move away from the collective and state provision, and the substitution of public funds with private funds. And these developments have far-reaching implications and potentially unintended consequences for graduates. Our CG research suggests that while graduates overall welcome income contingent loans and the safety nets that they provide, they believe that tuition fees are too high and interest rates are too high, and the loan repayments feel absolutely never ending. But our research also shows that the funding mechanisms and the process of individualization have created a very uneasy relationship between the graduate debtor and the state lender. Most graduates who we interviewed not only blame the system of student loans and the state for any negative consequences of their borrowing, but significantly, they also blame themselves, indicative, I think, of the psychological burden of student loan debt. And the negative impact of student loan debt falls on a continuum. There's a minority of graduates out there who say that they are completely and utterly unaffected by their student loan debt. a sizable minority are substantially negatively affected, leaving the majority affected, but only in minor ways. And their loan debt can influence choices about whether or not to engage in postgraduate study. It definitely affects their housing options, career and job choices, and their financial and psychological well-being and security. And it can even affect their decisions around family formation. So what our studies do and what our research does, it does challenge some of the policy rhetoric surrounding income contingent loans. The rhetoric always presents income contingent loans as positive and harmless transactions between the graduate and the state. Now, I'm not criticizing income contingent loans. They are far better than the key alternative out there. But the harmful effects or potential effects of income contingent loans are absent from the policy agenda or are totally ignored. The inbuilt protective features of these loans are presented as protecting graduates from financial hardship and any negative impact of loan debt. But I would argue that this is a partial characterization. And by examining the subjective experiences of graduates and what student loan debt means to graduates and how it affects them, it's clear that these features are not always effective safeguards. And I think this is because income contingent loans are designed to protect against financial hardship and the financial burden of student loans. They are not designed to tackle the psychological burden of student loan debt and how it interacts with the financial burdens of debt. So to conclude, returning to Tro, loans can and do promote equity by facilitating access to higher education. But they can also promote inequality too, through unaffordable loan repayments, which can curtail graduates' choices and limit their life opportunities. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let's sort out the clicker. No. Well, once the slides start to work, it turns out I've been with the Institute almost for 10 years, and I've looked at graduate jobs for almost 10 years now. So it's an anniversary for me as well as for the center, which I'm very pleased about. So I'm going to talk about work that I and Professor Francis Green have been working on as part of this Center for Global Higher Education. Initially led by Professor Francis Green, our work through 2 rounds of CGHE has uncovered critical insights into how the labor market can amplify or mitigate inequalities among graduates, echoing some of the issues Simon raised in his lecture. So that would be the second slide now. Thank you. There are many ways to approach equity in the graduate labor market. While much discussion on graduate labor market success focuses on individual employability or so-called low-quality degrees, our work argues for a broader perspective. We have identified, thank you, the significant yet often overlooked role of jobs themselves in utilizing graduate skills effectively. This oversight matters because equitable graduate outcomes hinge not just on education, but on how their skills are valued and utilized in the workplace. In our work for the center, we looked at what graduates do at work to better understand how graduate labor market success and the nature of their work connect. One of our key findings is that job content drives inequity in outcomes, including the underemployment, penalties in pay, skills utilization, and job satisfaction. Another critical finding is that, at least for Britain, these inequities did not emerge or became more pertinent because employers stopped valuing the work graduates usually deliver. In fact, we find that employers pay extra for job tasks usually associated with graduate skills. In other words, graduates in Britain are valued for what they do, and this economic value has changed little over the period of education expansion. Our way of looking at how the supply of graduates connects with the wider economy is through the lens of graduate mismatch or overeducation or underemployment. In other words, graduates in non-graduate roles. Graduates in non-graduate roles cannot make effective use of their skills, have lower earnings than peers in graduate roles, and are less satisfied with their job, indicating that these are generally not happy choices. In short, mismatch is an important facet of inequality among graduates and potentially across countries. It is of course also politically relevant, as the English government quotes overeducation as evidence for skills imbalances in the economy and uses it as an indicator to ascertain low-value degrees. The chart in this slide depicts the share of graduates outside of high-skilled jobs differentiated by countries across income levels. There are three takeaways here. Graduate mismatch is an issue, a global issue. More than a fifth of graduates work outside high-skilled job roles in about 80% of the countries in this chart. However, there were huge differences across countries, ranging from less than 10% outside of graduate roles to nearly 100% of graduates working outside of graduate roles. Graduate underemployment tends to shrink with countries' income level, but this relationship is not deterministic. Korea, for example, is a high-income country with a relatively high share of graduates outside graduate roles. Sri Lanka, on the other hand, is a lower middle-income country with few mismatched graduates. In short, graduate mismatch is a worldwide issue, which has become more pertinent with time. The chart in this slide depicts the time trend in underemployment within countries for which there is sufficiently longitudinal evidence. Within these countries, the percentage of underemployment graduates has surged up from about 22% to closer to 29% by the 2020s, a change of more than 30% in relative terms. This matters for the individual graduate who struggles more to get into jobs they might have hoped for when they attended university. It matters for student finances, as these will be typically less well-paid jobs, and it matters for the economy as a whole, as skills lay dormant and go to waste. This mismatch between graduate skills and job roles not only highlights inequalities, but points to broader economic inefficiencies. This becomes even more pertinent as we see underemployment trends worsening over time, underscoring the need for understanding the root causes to provide targets for policy intervention. In our work at the center, Francis and I attempted to better understand the drivers of graduate underemployment. The academic literature at that time tended to look at skill gaps to explain why graduates end up in non-graduate roles. However, in our research, we found that differences in individual skills contributed little to levels of graduate underemployment in any of the countries for which we had data. While in all countries that we examined, matched graduates were more skilled than mismatched graduates, hypothetically lifting mismatched graduate skills up to the level of the average matched graduate would have done little to reduce overall employment. That's this hypothetical mismatch scenario is the little, are the gray bars. We argue instead that levels of underemployment are caught up between graduate supply and high skill demand. This chart shows the growth rate of the relative graduate labor supply. That's the growth rate of tertiary attainment net of the growth in high skill employment. The changing proportion of individual graduates who find themselves underemployed is positively related to the changing relative supply. Countries at the high end, Slovakia and the Czech Republic, notably saw the largest increase in the percentage of mismatched graduates, while at the lower end, Estonia and Germany, countries with little or no change in relative supply, even experienced a small drop in the proportion who were underemployed. In other words, graduate underemployment as an issue has become more pertinent. Individual skill differences are secondary, demand and supply seems primary. However, these evaluations are based on occupations, and that needs to be taken with a bit of pinch of salt. Occupation-based measures of skill requirement ignore the large heterogeneity in the types of jobs within occupations, and especially how these jobs have changed with time. Illuminating how graduate skill requirements have changed at the level of jobs and how we can use it to better understand the race between supply and demand, particularly in the British graduate labour market, has become my main interest in the last few years. Before going into the key findings, I want to just give you a brief bird's eye view of the state of the British graduate labour market because of the rapid expansion starting in the early 1990s, Britain is an interesting case study to examine dynamics of the graduate labour market more generally. 3 points here. First, there has been a steady and fast increase in tertiary attainment from the mid-90s to now. Secondly, over most of the expansion, the tertiary graduate earnings premium, chart 2, held up. However, it started to slip more recently in around 2018, a trend that accelerated through the pandemic. And finally, while the pay premium stayed stable, within graduate pay inequality edged up. That's the chart 3. In 1995, the top 10% of graduates earned about 2.9 times what the bottom 10% got. By 2013, the ratio had risen to 3.3. But this rise in inequity arrested in the last decade, according to the data we've got. This stable pay premium here is often given as evidence that demand kept up with supply until about 5 years ago. However, this is indirect evidence. To better understand demand, I was keen to approach this through the jobs people do rather than the pay they earn. To do this, I looked at worker-reported job task data. I constructed an index of graduate skill requirement as a probability that a degree is required to get the job, given the job task profile people are asked to carry out. Job tasks are consider numerous activities where graduates might have an advantage, such as writing long documents, doing stats, providing expertise, solving complex problems, planning ahead, and so forth. The chart in this slide depicts the close relationship between the derived index of graduate skill requirements and hourly pay at the occupation level. As you can see, what people do in their job is very strongly associated with the wages their job pays across the entire graduate skill requirement distribution. There are 3 notable exceptions here: transport associate professionals, this includes air traffic controllers, train drivers, and airplane pilots, and health professionals are paid more than their ranking in the graduate skill requirement distribution would suggest. By contrast, research professionals, which are the occupation group with the highest level of graduate skill requirements, were paid quite a bit less than skill requirements would suggest. I leave you to judge if these exceptions affect the validity of the skill requirement measure. The relevance of job content is particularly instructive for understanding the mechanisms behind the job market penalties that typically come with education underemployment. Mismatched graduates tend to have lower earnings, as I already said, are less able to use their skills and abilities, tend to be less content with their job. Estimates of these penalties are displayed in the blue bars in the chart in this slide. The figures suggest medium penalties of mismatch for pay and skills utilization and a more modest penalty for job satisfaction. However, once we account for the observed differences in job task profiles between matched and mismatched graduates, these penalties become smaller and in case of job satisfaction disappear, suggesting that job content drives these underemployment penalties.
1 minute, Golo.
Yeah. Given the importance of job tasks for graduate labor market success, one might wonder if employers have become less willing to pay a premium for the tasks graduates usually carry out. We examined the price that employers pay for the work embodied in graduate skill requirements and find that British employers valued these non-routine cognitive and interpersonal tasks that graduates usually perform. As much in 2017, when we had the last available data, as they did 20 years earlier, demonstrating that employers were willing to pay extra for tasks commonly associated with graduate level skills, at least up until 6 years ago. In all, our research underscores the critical role of job design and labor market dynamics for graduate outcomes. Addressing underemployment, enhancing equity requires not just attention on education, but a concerted effort to upskill job roles to match the evolving skill sets of graduates. Policymakers should therefore prioritize job upskilling as a strategic lever for both individuals and economic growth. And that's it. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Is it on? Good morning, everybody. This is Ho Mok from Lingnan University in Hong Kong. I'm part of the project examining about experience and effect of international education on graduate employability from Asia. One sort of time, I just present to you part of the finding today, focusing on Chinese students studying in the UK. Simon has given a wonderful lecture this morning, outlining about the three dilemmas confronting future's higher education. Indeed, if we look into the three challenges as a context, I think China has been going through the similar challenges. Number one, going through the massification and stratification of higher education in the last few decades. And at the same time, Chinese higher education system has also been affected by neoliberal's approach and becoming more competitive. Last but not the least, Chinese system has been going through globalization of higher education by encouraging more students to expose themselves for overseas learning, not only for getting the degree or qualifications as such for job. I echo what Simon has mentioned. Students, they join education, higher education. It's not only about getting the qualification for job only. It's not either or, but and. They want to have cultural formation and self-formation. And my following research has indicated with some evidence supporting the argument. And similar to the study by Golo, China, just like other major systems in the world, face about the growing graduate supply because of massification of higher education. But at the same time, graduates today, they face about the Chinese world, facing about falling wage premium, and try to struggle for stabilizing pay mapping ability. I think it's not the only experience in China, but it's very common in Asia or other parts of the world with the rise of the growth of higher education enrollments. When you look into the increase of international students, there's an international mobile students physically cross-border education, and United Kingdom is one of the very popular choice okay, among Chinese students. And China has become the top exporting countries of international students, not only to this country, but also all around the world, particularly before the COVID, the breakout of the COVID-19 pandemic. But even during the COVID and in the post-COVID era, we also witness with evidence that students in China are very keen to go for overseas learning because they want to enhance their global competitiveness through international learning experience. And looking into the statistics showing that the highest number of international students in the UK belong to China. According to the study, the number has risen by 87% in the last decade or so. So with this background, my team has tried to understand about the employability of mainland Chinese students with international experience in the UK. More specifically, we try to understand about how does the mass media shape the public perception of Chinese graduates studying in the UK, and how do the general public and employer perceive British international graduates in terms of their education and employment. But most important of all, we are very interested in how true is the perceived benefits have turned into reality. Simply put, we use secondary data analysis and also make use of the social listening techniques for gathering text, try to understand past some kind of interview with selected students. To many mainland students in China, international study and employability, they are linked together because not only embrace in international learning for enhancing their employability skills, but much more important is about whole person development. Investing in higher education is one thing very fundamental to Chinese families. No matter how rich they are or how poor they are, one of the major family obligations is to prepare and nurture their son and daughter to become educated person. And saving money for education, particularly if they have money, they want to have the best education opportunity for their kids. So employability skills part of the formula, if you like, shaping about decisions for overseas learning. But at the same time, they are not only talking about affordability, reputation, quality of education, but more importantly, they think that education experience is so important. Let's go back to what Simon has mentioned. It is very much our traditional Chinese belief education is not only getting a qualification alone. It's not only about mobility alone. It's more about the whole person formation, the self-formation, and cultural transformation. And the employability developed from the international study also point out about the positive advantages. Accumulative, multiple and mutually reinforcing form of capital, especially for those students that are fortunate to go to overseas learning in high, prestigious universities. And how about the situation in China? International graduate employability in China labor market, our literature review has shown that overseas education experience have historically been recognized as offering an advantage in the Chinese labor market, particularly 10 and 20 years ago. And mainland Chinese students have regarded it as a further opportunity to enhance their experience and confer substantial advantage on their return to China. But with more and more students having overseas learning experience, it's a kind of supply and demand side. More supply, would it mean that students going overseas learning when return home will have a better job opportunities? And research indicates this is no longer as 20 years ago because more supply of overseas returnees. One third of the employer perceive a graduate with overseas experience as more employable, with studying overseas making an applicant well-grounded in terms of skills, experience, and personal development. Again, reinforcing about the Chinese thinking about education is not only getting a degree alone. It's about whole person, it's a self-formation, it's also cultural enrichment. But however, you and I have experienced the disturbance or even double disturbance of the COVID. With the COVID, and also the growing impact of geopolitics would affect student choices in China for overseas learning. Definitely, there's an impact on Chinese students, especially when they face about the international media projecting about the abuse or anti-Asian movement during the COVID era because of the public hygiene behavior. We are different from Western people. And we found about health hazard and symbolic violence in international research indicating about Asian students have some worry, but in the last 12 months, we also witness more and more Chinese and Asian students. They are very determined to go for overseas learning, but not necessarily go back to the traditional destination they used to because of the kind of geopolitics and also the impact of this kind of international media talking about the rising, nationalism and also anti-Asian or Chinese student movement around the world. But indeed, when you look into the most recent white paper on studying in China released by New Oriental Education Technology Group, shows 51% of employers in China require graduate returning from abroad to have a master's degree or even a doctoral degree. So trust me, students in China are very keen about further education. Coming from Hong Kong, I can report to you, despite the international media saying that Hong Kong is very unsafe, but we receive more and more applications from China, mainland, and overseas going to our university in the last few years, even during the COVID era. When securing jobs may not be easy, the survey data from 2023 showed that the starting salary for those with overseas qualification was generally higher than the domestic graduates, according to this research. And how about the perception of graduates? Okay, Chinese graduate about the employment in China after overseas learning. The first slide gives you the idea about they see at least a perception advantages having the international learning experience. How about whether they perceive as a kind of confidence? They are very confident, okay, especially before they get the job. But again, it's a mixed feeling. When they really get into the labor market returning home, they become very anxious, uncertain, especially reflected by in detail about different level of degree, undergraduate, master, and also the doctoral degree, showing you about the various level of confidence or anxiety when getting into the labor market. So we do some kind of analysis during the 2022 and 23rd academic year. We reviewed the University of Sheffield undertook a new study about Chinese student experience. It's interesting, they show that the impact of studying in the UK on employability for Chinese students from the perspective of both students themselves and employers. This is some key finding. Both employers and graduates agree studying in the UK significantly enhanced their attribute as follows listed out here. They're not only talking about skills in the job preparation, but more about the generic attributes that Chinese students and the employer in China think about the whole person development and as more important. However, we also see some kind of differences between employer and the students. I won't go into detail, but this is a kind of the contrast between the two. And employer prioritize university ranking, degree qualification, and study duration. Only a short time, they may not think this is good enough. They prefer a longer stay in their study. An employer thought that the returning student may have inflated salary expectations. They have higher one. They may not be able to match. But graduate viewed relocating to Tier 1 city as one of the advantages of studying abroad. They go for first-tier city, but not to the second-tier and third-tier city. But in mainland China, there are more jobs available in the second-tier and third-tier city rather than the first-tier city. It's understandable. So I would graduate having the overseas learning. I would go for the major city in the coastal area for prosperity. This is a different perception. And there are also perceptions that the university are solely interested in international students as a source of revenue. And there's also a cultural differences as we found. So what kind of lesson learned from this study? Chinese, just like Asian students, still see overseas learning will have positive impact on their future development, especially career, but also personal self-formation possibility. Overseas learning definitely broadens graduates' horizon and international outlook, that they think this is extremely important. But local connection and network still matter in job search back home. And when you talk to mainland students and graduating from the local university, they have the network and alumni will make them easier to get job. But however, I think the post-COVID-19 era, geopolitics on international student mobility may still go on. And what is the major lesson we draw from this particular study? I want to conclude by 4C. I think we are all facing uncertain and unstable future. I think we are facing about confrontation. So in what way we can enable our students having the overseas learning experience to engage them in the cross-cultural understanding, to prepare them to be more internationally open? This is the first C. Confrontation is possible, but embrace diversity with the second C, engage our students for collaboration. And not only collaborate, but also be a good communicator. The first C is about communication. Having overseas learning, international learning experience, cross-cultural learning is important to become more effective communication. And the last is about hope that we can engage our students, universities, and nations to work together for co-creation of a better space for higher education. And Chinese students and Asian students are very keen to go for overseas learning because this can enable them to become more competitive in the global market. But at the same time, they see it is not only about qualification for job alone. This is a kind of cultural understanding, becoming more globally aware, and more importantly, it's a kind of self-formation. So I think I call for more collaboration, and we are facing a very challenging time, as Simon has rightly pointed out in his lecture, and we are in the sector, we need to co-create with different stakeholders for creating a better space for future generations. And thank you very much.
Okay, can you hear me? Yeah, a few nods, good. So I'm here to talk to you about the Graduate Experiences of Employability and Knowledge Project, the GEEK project. I think that's a brilliant name, but other people don't seem quite so keen. Anyway, and this is an international project that's a collaboration between a UK team from Lancaster, which includes me, Jan MacArthur, Kaylee Rosewell and Dee Dalgleish, a team that was largely based in South Africa of Margaret Blackie, Renee Schmidt and Ashish Agarwal, and a US team, Jenny Case, who's here, Nicole Peterson, Alar Abdullah, and Benjamin Goldsnyder. But it's really important to say, although we were 3 international teams, we all worked with all of the data. It wasn't that we had a US case study, a UK case study, and a South African case study. We looked at all of the data together. And this project is part of what's turned into a 7-year longitudinal study. So in the first phase of CG, we looked at chemistry and chemical engineering students as they worked their way through their degrees. We started off with around 60 students, and then by the end of their undergraduate studies in each discipline, 6 students in each discipline, and by the end we had about 42 chemistry students and 43 engineering students left in the study. And then for the GEEK project, we followed them into employment for 3 years. And at the end, we still had 38 chemistry students and 33 chemical engineering graduates in the study. These are the same people that we've talked to each year over 7 years. And the fact that we managed to retain so many students largely goes down to the quality of the interviews that Kaylee Rosewell did in the second phase of the project. They're beautiful interviews to read. They really give a rich sense of what these students were looking at. So this is an international study, but I want to relate it to the policy context in England. And I would say, and it's not just me, but I would say that the Auger Review, the independent report to review post-18 education and funding in 2019, really set a new phase of policy for higher education. What that review did is, first of all, it shifted from a focus on higher education to a focus on post-18 education. And secondly, it really positioned graduate outcomes in terms of salary as a measure of the quality of higher education. So, to quote probably too much at length, but I think it's important from the Auger Review itself. So they say, we have used the available data to consider the economic value for students and the economy of different higher educational routes for different people. However, we are clear that successful outcomes for both students and society are about more than pay. Higher levels of education are associated with wider participation in politics and civic affairs and better physical and mental health. We also understand that the social value of some lower earning professionals, such as nursing and social care, and the cultural value of studying the arts and humanities. The earnings data enable us to make economically defined value calculations, not value judgments. Assessing this wider value is very difficult, but government should continue to work to ensure that wider considerations are taken into account in its policy and funding decisions. Now, the reason I've quoted that at length is because that is the rhetorical strategy that we now have in policy. Oh, other things are important too. Well, we focus on salary. That is basically the move. So in November 2022, in a speech to the Times Higher Education Conference, the Minister for Skills, Apprenticeships and Higher Education, Robert Halfon, said, "I believe 21st century universities should have three main purposes: meeting the skill needs of the economy, providing quality qualifications that lead to well-paid jobs, advancing social justice by helping disadvantaged applicants onto the first rung of the ladder of opportunity." So if I was going to summarise those 3 bullet points, jobs, jobs, jobs. And then in the delayed response to the Auger report published in 2023, when that was released, the press release had the headline, "Crack down on rip-off university degrees." I mean, a government saying that about its universities, it should be astounding. The fact that it isn't tells us how far we've come. Now, I think it's important to recognise that there were some factors that contributed to this shift in focus. So first of all, it was made possible by the development of the longitudinal educational outcomes data, the LEO data. To be clear, what educational outcomes means in that is employment. The ability to link where students studied, their educational outcomes, to their tax returns meant that it was suddenly possible at an individual level to look at the impact. And then secondly, concerns about the costs of unpaid student loans to government made it urgent. So it was made possible and urgent by these two factors. But what's so problematic about this, we would argue from our project, is that it completely misses out the educational purpose, the educational role of studying for a degree. So if we go back to our study, we deliberately selected chemistry and chemical engineering because of the way they grew out of the need for practical applications and the needs of industry. That's where they came from. Another project I was involved in sociology, where we looked at students' relations to knowledge and sociology, always got the reaction, but that's sociology. That's what they're like. So what we wanted to do was to take chemistry and chemical engineering and look at how students developed. And if you think about when the people involved in our study were graduating, they were graduating into the pandemic. That was the moment at which they finished their educational studies. But most of them have done well. There's been an impact on their mental health, an impact on the roles that are available, but 82% of the chemical engineers and over 90% of the chemists are in what would be called graduate roles or studying for PhDs or masters. And when we talk to them about what's the most important thing you gained from studying chemistry or chemical engineering, which we did every year after graduation, 2/3 of them talk about either a way of viewing the world or the rigor of the educational experience they had. They don't talk about the job, they don't talk about the salary, they don't talk about the certificate. They say this is a way of engaging with the world. And more importantly, the students or graduates who talk about seeing it in terms of a way of viewing the world or the rigor of their education experience tend to have better outcomes than the students who talk about it was for a degree or it's for specific skills. So just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about there. So this is a quote in the 7th year of the study from Lekan, who's a graduate, we've given this pseudonym Lekan, who's at Birmingham University, which is an English university, and he's now in a role as a business analyst. and he's talking about the most important thing he gained from his degree. And he says, just coming back to that way of thinking, I think it's very beautiful that one can have some numbers and some drawings on a paper on the theoretical basis and be able to translate that into tangible things. I absolutely think that that is something that is beautiful. I think beautiful is the word, really. It's something I will always appreciate. That I can have some algebraic equation and it ends up forming how something moves inside of a pipe for obviously a larger means and end. So this is a chemical engineer who, what he got was this way of seeing. Contrast this, say, with Kaylee, who was a chemist from Argonne, which is one of the American universities. When she talks about her degree, she says, I don't know. Honestly, it feels like a big old black hole. I think maybe like confidence, maybe talking about sciencey things, or being part of those conversations or listening to it. Gives me a little bit of credibility, I guess. I would say that's it, probably. Now, Kaylee is a research scientist. In terms of the government focused in England, she's had a very good outcome. Compare what she says to Robert at Europeum, who's a retail shop assistant, and now is applying for graduate roles. And Robert says, I feel like the whole systems view of thinking is something that's hard to kick after you've done the degree, because you constantly ask yourself, okay, what are the smaller parts of things? And how does each unit make the whole? Even at work, even when my job is just routine, I know which each part of the business or each part of the task I'm supposed to do feeds into the whole. A lot of my co-workers don't really see that. It's been useful. So the point I'm making is that in measures of employment outcomes in terms of salary, you would say, well, Kaylee's had a far better quality degree than Robert. But you look at actually how they talk about their education, and I would say it starkly pushes in the opposite direction. And what's crucial here is that when we talk about generic attributes or graduate skills, they're not meaningfully generic. They only gain their meaning from the ways of viewing the world, from the knowledge that students engage with. And when we take that knowledge out, it's essentially meaningless. So this focus on graduate outcomes in terms of salary and job roles is problematic for 4 key reasons, I would argue. First, it narrows down the purposes of higher education to a production of a skilled workforce, which is not what most degrees are designed to do. Most degrees are designed to bring students into contact with a body of knowledge. And if we're then measured in a way that doesn't reflect what they're intended to do, then we lose that sense of what's going on educationally. This also gives prospective students a misleading sense of what higher education is about. The fact that any benefits that they gain from higher education are dependent on their engagement with disciplinary bodies of knowledge. If they don't engage with the knowledge, they don't get the benefits. And so there's no straightforward relationship between what they're studying and what they might do in the future, and they only gain if they engage with that knowledge. And also, it misleads students about what a high-quality education is. If all the measure is about avoiding low-value degrees, about what you earn, and you think that's what counts as a high-quality degree, then you're being missold an education. Now, I would argue that higher education really needs to challenge this more fully than it does. It's clearly very difficult to challenge for many reasons. But it needs to reassert the educational nature of higher education. What higher education currently does is if it looks good on a measure, it says, oh yeah, that's right. League tables, we know they're meaningless, but I did well, I put them on the side of the building. This place loves putting rankings on the side of the building. We know they're nonsense. How can we argue against misleading measures if we use them when they are in our favour? So we have to move away from commercial rankings. We have to move back to the educational purposes of a higher education degree if we want to be convincing in arguing that it's a relationship to knowledge that is the important outcome of higher education.
Okay, thanks all of our speakers. So we have about 15 minutes for Q&A. Perhaps if you could put your hands up as before and say where you're from if you'd like to ask a question. Nick.
Thank you, Nick Ullman. I'm from Higher Education Policy Institute. Thank you for those great presentations. I have one particular question I'd like to put to Paul, because I thought, while I recognise Paul's critique, I think it left out something really important, which is if you're Rob Halfon or the Minister for Universities, part of your job is to persuade the Treasury that it is worth investing in our sector. And your competitors in that are every other cabinet minister for every other public service. And so, you know, the minister's not in the room to explain what he does, but I think that's a really important part of the story that I didn't hear in your presentation. And I wonder if you had any comment on it.
Yeah, I think it's still on. So, no, I completely agree, Nick. And really, my argument is for higher education to sort out the way it talks about the outcomes of higher education. Ministers are going to minister. I think those challenges about if higher education says we lead to employment, then that's how we're measured, is completely acceptable, those you know, and completely right. And those Treasury questions are exactly right. But then actually, if higher education wants to challenge that, they have to recognise there's a huge cost to doing so. And if they don't want to challenge it, then they actually need to change the nature of degrees so they are focused on employment outcomes in the way they are now. So my kind of position is more about that higher education needs to get real. Either we're about employment outcomes and we need to change the nature of the education we offer, or we're about something else and we need to articulate that and recognise that that has costs involved.
Anybody else on the panel want to comment on that? Question over there.
Hi, I'm Lorraine Dearden, University College London. I was involved in CGHE in the first incarnation and did lots of works on income contingent loans. So my questions to Claire. I mean, I think we all agree that, you know, the current income contingent loan system in the UK could be better designed, but I always ask, you know, when we're looking at what system we have for higher education finance, we have to say compared to what. I was in Indonesia 2 weeks ago where there is absolutely no student loan system. There's fees to attend public universities, no loan system. So kids from poor backgrounds don't go to university. I mean, you know, it's a 30 times difference between those at the bottom and those at the top because they can't afford to. So you need some good loan system, and I think income contingent loans designed well provide that, compared to not going to university and the implications that has. So I think income contingent loans are right. I agree we should have grants for support. It shouldn't be that the poorest have the biggest loans, but it has built-in insurance. I would argue that it actually has a much better and protective impact for things like family formation decisions. If you have 5 years off having a child, there's no implications in terms of having to repay your student loan. So I think it's important to be critical of the current system, but, you know, I think it's really important to think, if we don't have a loan system, what else can we have? And that's really important in terms of getting access for the poorest.
Okay, Claire.
Okay. Lorraine, I totally agree with you, and in there was an argument saying there's no question that income contingent loans are far superior to the key alternative loan system, namely mortgage-style loans. And I would go to the end of the road or wherever I have to go to in order to support income contingent loans. My concern is that they can be improved, but there's also some recognition of potentially harmful effects and the extent to which within the design those potentially harmful effects can be incorporated. My suggestion being that there's sort of both direct financial impacts and there's indirect financial impacts. And we need to take that on board in terms of the overall design. And my concern is that is totally ignored within the policy rhetoric and within the policy debate. So, for example, and it poses a very real dilemma. The length of time that graduates have to repay their debt before it's forgiven. That creates a fantastic psychological burden on graduates, because there's this very strong sense that these payments are absolutely never ending. And that has a toll. Interestingly, the fact that in England the repayments are deducted at source through graduates' pay packet probably has quite a positive impact psychologically, because actually it means that certain proportions of graduates can ignore their repayments because it's all taken care of and they don't have to worry. But what I'm trying to argue is that for some of the other impacts are taken into consideration in the overall design. I'm not trying to suggest in any way that income contingent loans should be jettisoned for mortgage-style loans. I might want to argue, though, that do we look at alternative ways? For example, do we revisit notions of a graduate tax?
Okay. Johnny.
Thanks very much. Johnny Rich from the Engineering Professors Council, amongst other places, in Access organisation Push as well. Given that an income contingent loan is in effect a form of income tax, a higher rate of income tax on a graduate, and that is going to be paid through the graduate task premium, to use Golo's expression, that employers are willing to pay a higher amount for those graduate skills. Why not achieve a more equitable balance between the employer and the student's investment in their future employability by having a greater role for the employer in paying for the education? What is the role of the employer in ensuring this? Because then you might also get a better match, of a better balance when it comes to the undermatch.
Golo, do you want to have a go at that?
Is this on? Yeah. Indeed, it's a very good point thinking about how to include employers more in the whole system. In fact, if you look at what happened to workplace training, it's been gone down. What happened to employer funding on training has gone down as well. And maybe in part that's the response to a system that funds education expansion primarily through tax and student loans, through the individual. It's indeed would be. Indeed seems a very smart idea to think more how to include employers in this. I mean, it's happened in further education sector where, I mean, it's quite messy. If you look at the apprenticeship, what happened to apprenticeship standards and how these are organized. But if there's some form of involvement through the sandwich degrees, for example, is definitely something to consider.
Okay. Got a question here? Yeah.
My name is Moyosere from Teesside University, Middlesbrough. I just have a simple question. The question is, sometimes I look at some universities, basically more of African universities. They have some courses. For example, we have a student studying, let's say, educational leadership, for example. And while the student is in school, there are some courses that have been attached to the program that basically it doesn't really suit the course of this program. And by the time the student is done in school, you find out to know that there are some courses that he actually did while in school that are not relevant and which sometimes affect the employability. So in situations like that, what can the student or what is expected of university or government to do?
So do you mean, do the courses retain their relevance for the work that students and graduates may move on to afterwards. I guess that's an issue about the calibration between what happens in universities and what happens in the labour market, and the extent to which universities should be expected to be responding to that. Carl Ho, do you have a view on that?
Well, part of the finding of our research in the past indicated students are very concerned about putting that way institutional support for them, especially in preparing them for the labor market. But it all depends on where the student from and what sort of support they're looking for. And some institutions in the UK have a very good student support services, but some may not have enough. So that's why I think the institutional support will be a very important aspect, especially during the COVID. We conducted another piece study asking about international students from 26 countries, their experience during the COVID. One of the major concerns is about institutions around the world. Among these 26 countries, they are not well prepared for offering sufficient and appropriate support for students, including preparing them for graduate employment. So I think this is not only about the curriculum, it's about the learning experience and student support dimension.
Yeah. Paul, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I think that's right. I also think it's about, for me, it's about curriculum design. If universities are going to make claims about preparing students for employment, then they need to show how their curriculum is designed to do that.
Yeah.
And if they're going to do that, they need to involve employers as well as learning technologists, academic developers, in redesigning the curriculum. And actually, you know, for me, an awful lot of work on quality in education, higher education, is based on individuals doing training courses. And it would be much better if we shifted that effort to redesign curricula that brings employers in. One thing, though, to be really careful about is that most people say, if we take UK as an example, are employed in SMEs, small, medium-sized enterprises. If you look at who dominates the rhetoric about employability, they're multinational corporations. They don't employ nearly so many people. So there needs to be a much more equalising debate about who counts as employers and how they engage in that process of curriculum design. But universities have to recognise the cost of their promises. They're going to promise to make students employable, then the cost of that promise is bringing employers in to look at the curriculum together, whilst recognising the different kinds of expertise they each have, you know, that give them different roles in that process.
Great, thanks. One more question just at the back, last one.
Yeah, Wahid Kassar, I'm the founder of First Islamic Bank here. You know, when I look at the student loans, I see pretty destructive and devastating effect and the impact on society for the next couple of decades. Because I think we are widening the gap between the rich and poor, and we are not really encouraging the middle and the lower middle class to come up and equip themselves with the education and be a better citizen. In terms of managing the loan process that we have today, I think it's quite punitive. What should be done, I think it should be, you know, the policymaker and the politicians, they should be putting a thinking cap on and say, okay, how can we manage this in a much more effective way? So let's say, for example, if the average loan at the end of 2 or 3 years education period is, let's say, 40 or 50,000, and if the amount deducted from the salary of each of those students is, let's say, between 200 to 250 per month, which is then tax deductible, that means we add on to the allowances that are given before they are taxed. That's one, and it will encourage them. And secondly, in next 4 to 5 years, they will be able to pay back the loan. And the other thing I would suggest, the government, they should take the burden of the interest. So the student should only pay the principal, and they should not be penalized with the interest on top of that, which obviously I think it's a, you know, cumulative interest anyway, which is a compound interest. So, I mean, I can just go on, but I think in the interest
is your
of time,
question, do you agree?
Thank you.
Glad you agree.
Well, it certainly would be interesting to look at alternative ways. Certainly the interest rate that the graduates pay is very unpopular, even the reduced rate that has been reintroduced for the cohort that started in 2023. but if there are other ways of formulating loans, that would be interesting to learn more about it and whether it could be done in practice.
Okay, thank you. All right, thanks everyone for excellent questions. So